Here's a number for you. $35 billion. That's what Phil Knight is worth today, roughly $35 billion. Enough to buy a small country, enough to purchase every professional sports team in Oregon, several times over. And here's another number, $50. That's what Phil Knight started with, $50 and a crazy idea, a handshake with his old college track coach, and a trunk full of Japanese running shoes. The distance between those two numbers, between $50 and $35 billion, that's not just a business story. That's one of the greatest entrepreneurial journeys in American history. This is the story of Nike. This is the story of the swoosh. But more than that, this is the story of Phil Knight, a shy kid from Portland who couldn't make the football team, an average student who barely graduated, a guy who spent his 20s selling shoes from the back of his car while working as an accountant. Not a Silicon Valley genius, not a Wall Street shark, just a regular guy with an obsession. So how does that happen? How does a regular guy, not a prodigy, not an heir to some fortune, build one of the most recognizable brands in human history? That's what we're going to explore today. The real story, the struggles, the lucky breaks, the moments when everything could have fallen apart. And here's the thing nobody tells you about Phil Knight. He wasn't special. He wasn't the fastest runner on his college team. He wasn't the smartest student in his MBA program. He was just obsessed. Obsessed with one crazy idea that everyone else thought was ridiculous. But we'll get to that idea. First, let's go back to the beginning. Portland, Oregon, February 24th, 1938. Philip Hampson Knight was born into a family that valued hard work over handouts. His father, Bill Knight, had been a lawyer but transitioned into newspaper publishing, eventually running the Oregon Journal. His mother, Lotta, was a homemaker who provided the warmth and stability that balanced her husband's tougher approach. Now, Bill Knight, Phil's father, was what you might call old school. Loving, yes, but demanding. He believed that nothing valuable came without struggle. Here's a perfect example. When Phil was a teenager, he asked his dad for a summer job at the newspaper. Seemed reasonable, right? Work for the family business, learn the ropes. His father said no. Not because he didn't love his son, but because he believed Phil needed to find his own way, earn his own opportunities, build his own foundation. So what did Phil do? He walked right over to the Oregon Journal's biggest competitor, the Oregonian, and got himself a job there, working the night shift, tabulating sports scores until the early morning hours. And then, every morning after his shift, he would run home. 7 miles, through the quiet Portland streets, just him and his thoughts, and the rhythm of his feet hitting pavement. That run, that became everything to Phil Knight. You see, Phil wasn't built for contact sports, too small for football, couldn't quite figure out baseball. But running made sense to him. Running was honest. You put in the work, you got results. No politics, no favoritism, just you against the clock. In 1955, Phil enrolled at the University of Oregon, and that's where his life would change forever. Not because of what he learned in classrooms, though he earned a degree in journalism. No, his life changed because of a man named Bill Bowerman. Bill Bowerman was already a legend in track and field circles, the head coach of Oregon's track team, a man who had coached multiple sub-4-minute milers, a perfectionist who drove his athletes relentlessly. But Bowerman had a peculiar obsession beyond coaching. He was obsessed with shoes, not in a fashion sense, in an engineering sense. Bowerman believed that the running shoes available to American athletes were primitive, heavy, poorly designed. He would literally take shoes apart in his garage, rebuild them, modify them, trying to shave off ounces, improve traction, reduce injuries. His runners were his guinea pigs. They'd show up to practice, and Bowerman would hand them some Frankenstein creation he'd cobbled together the night before. Sometimes the shoes were brilliant, sometimes they fell apart mid-race, but Bowerman never stopped tinkering. Phil Knight was a decent runner under Bowerman, not great. His personal best in the mile was 4 minutes and 13 seconds, respectable but not elite. He won his varsity letters, made the team, but he was never going to be a champion. What Phil absorbed from Bowerman wasn't athletic technique, it was something deeper. He absorbed the obsession, the idea that shoes mattered, the vision that American running shoes could be better, much better, if someone just reimagined them from scratch. Phil graduated from Oregon in 1959, did a year of military service, active duty, then 7 years in the Army Reserve. And then came a decision that would define his future. He enrolled at Stanford Graduate School of Business. Now, for most of his academic life, Phil had been an indifferent student. School felt like something to endure, not embrace. But Stanford was different. At Stanford, Phil took a class on entrepreneurship from a professor named Frank Schallenberger. And Schallenberger gave his students an assignment: write a paper outlining a new business idea. Most students probably dashed off something forgettable. Phil Knight wrote a paper that would change his life. The title was a mouthful: Can Japanese Sport Shoes Do to German Sports Shoes What Japanese Cameras Did to German Cameras? The thesis was simple but powerful. At the time, German companies like Adidas and Puma dominated the athletic shoe market. They were expensive. They were entrenched. Everyone assumed they were unbeatable. But Phil argued that Japanese manufacturers, who had already disrupted the camera market by producing high-quality products at lower prices, could do the same thing in shoes: import Japanese running shoes, undercut the Germans, build a new market. When Phil handed in that paper, his classmates thought it was absurd. Running shoes? From Japan? Who cares about running shoes? But his professor saw something. Years later, Phil would describe that class as an aha moment, the first time school felt like it actually mattered. Phil graduated from Stanford in 1962, and now he had a choice: get a sensible job, start climbing the corporate ladder, or do something crazy. He decided to travel around the world on a shoestring budget, see places, experience life, and, oh yes, stop in Japan to see if maybe, just maybe, his paper could become more than just a homework assignment. He sold his car, borrowed $1,000 from his father, and flew to Tokyo. Now here's where the story gets interesting. Phil spent a while in Hawaii first, about 10 weeks, working odd jobs, selling encyclopedias door to door, basically procrastinating. He was nervous. Who wouldn't be? He was a 24-year-old with no business experience, no connections, no money, about to walk into Japanese corporate offices and pitch them on what exactly? Eventually, he made it to Japan, and after some research, he identified the company he wanted to approach: Onitsuka, makers of the Tiger running shoe, based in Kobe. Phil made an appointment, took a train from Tokyo to Kobe, spent the whole ride rehearsing his pitch, scribbling notes, trying to calm his nerves. And then he walked into that boardroom. The Onitsuka executives were polite, formal. They listened as this young American talked about the potential of the U.S. market, the opportunity to undercut German competition, the numbers from his Stanford paper. And then one of them asked a simple question: "What company do you represent?" Phil Knight froze. He didn't have a company. He didn't have a business card. He didn't have anything except an idea and a lot of nerve. And in that moment, looking at those Japanese executives waiting for an answer, Phil Knight made something up. He thought about his bedroom wall back home, covered in blue ribbons from track meets. "Blue Ribbon Sports," he said, "of Portland, Oregon." Blue Ribbon Sports, a company that didn't exist, named on the spot in a boardroom in Kobe, Japan. The executives nodded. The meeting continued, and by the end they agreed to send him samples, to give this young American with his made-up company a chance. Phil Knight walked out of that building with his heart pounding. He had no idea if anything would come of it, but he had a shot. It took more than a year for those samples to arrive. Phil went back to the States, got a job as an accountant, first at Price Waterhouse, then Coopers and Lybrand. He hated it, sitting in an office all day, crunching numbers for other people's businesses, while his own idea gathered dust. But finally, in late 1963, a package arrived from Japan. 12 pairs of beautiful cream and blue tiger running shoes. Phil held them in his hands, and the first thing he did was send 2 pairs to someone whose opinion mattered more than anyone else's: Bill Bowerman, his old coach at Oregon. Now Phil was hoping for maybe a sale, maybe an encouraging word. What he got instead would change everything. Bowerman didn't just buy the shoes, he offered to become Phil's partner. He wanted in. He wanted to provide product design ideas. He wanted to help build something. On January 25, 1964, Phil Knight and Bill Bowerman shook hands and formed Blue Ribbon Sports. Each invested $500. Total starting capital, $1,000. Their agreement was simple. Phil would handle the business side, sales, accounting, operations. Bowerman would focus on product, innovation, design, making the shoes better. And just like that, Nike was born. Well, not Nike yet, not by name, but the seed was planted. For the next 5 years, Phil Knight lived a double life. By day, he was a CPA, crunching numbers, filing returns, playing the part of the respectable professional. But on weekends? On weekends, he was a shoe dog. He loaded boxes of tiger shoes into the trunk of his green Plymouth Valiant and drove to track meets all across the Pacific Northwest. High school meets, college meets, any meet where runners gathered. He'd set up near the bleachers, pop open his trunk, and start talking. His pitch was simple. These Japanese shoes were lighter, better made, and cheaper than anything from Germany. Give them a try. Word spread fast. Runners told other runners. Coaches noticed. By 1965, Phil hired his first employee, a former runner named Jeff Johnson, to help handle the West Coast territory. And Phil eventually quit his accounting job to teach accounting at Portland State University. The pay was less, but the hours were shorter, which meant more time to build Blue Ribbon Sports. By 1969, something remarkable had happened. Blue Ribbon Sports had sold $1 million worth of shoes, $1 million, from a company that had started with a $1,000 handshake. But here's the thing about growth: it creates problems. See, Phil was successful enough now that Onitsuka was paying attention. The Japanese company looked at the American market and thought, "Why do we need this middleman? Why give Blue Ribbon a cut when we could sell direct?" Rumors started circulating. Onitsuka was meeting with other potential distributors, testing the waters for a takeover. The partnership that had built Blue Ribbon's success was becoming a liability. Phil was facing an existential crisis. His business model, distributing someone else's shoes, was about to collapse. He had two choices: fold or fight. He chose to fight. In 1971, Phil Knight and Bill Bowerman made the decision that would define their legacy. They would create their own shoe, their own brand, their own identity. They needed a name, something powerful, something memorable. Jeff Johnson, their first employee, was the one who found it. He dreamed it, actually, literally had a dream where the name came to him. Nike, the Greek goddess of victory. Phil wasn't sold at first. He wanted something more aggressive. Dimension 6 was one of his ideas, but deadlines were pressing, decisions had to be made. And Nike just felt right. Next, they needed a logo. Phil was still teaching at Portland State, and he knew a graphic design student there named Carolyn Davidson. He'd helped her out before, small design jobs, charts, presentations. Now he asked her for something bigger. Create a logo, something that conveys motion, something that looks good on a shoe. Davidson worked on several designs. After about 17 hours of work, she presented Phil with 5 options. One of them was a curved checkmark shape, fluid, dynamic, like a wing, like the wing of the goddess Nike herself. Phil looked at it for a long moment, and then he said something that would become legendary. "I don't love it, but it will grow on me." He paid Carolyn Davidson $35 for the design. $35 for what would become one of the most recognized logos in human history. The swoosh, worth billions today, created by a student for the price of a nice dinner. But a logo doesn't sell shoes. Innovation sells shoes. And that brings us to one of the most important moments in Nike history: the waffle iron. Bill Bowerman, remember, had spent decades obsessed with making shoes lighter and faster. He'd tried everything: different materials, different sole patterns, different constructions. His garage was basically a mad scientist's laboratory for footwear. In 1971, a new problem emerged. The University of Oregon was replacing its cinder track at Hayward Field with a synthetic surface, and Bowerman needed a shoe that could grip artificial turf without metal spikes, something versatile enough for track, grass, and hard surfaces. One Sunday morning, Bowerman was sitting at breakfast with his wife, Barbara. She was making waffles on an old waffle iron they'd received as a wedding gift back in 1936. Bowerman watched the waffle come out of the iron, the grid pattern, the raised squares, and suddenly something clicked. "What if you flipped it upside down?" he said to Barbara. "What if those raised nubs could be the sole of a shoe, grip without spikes, lightweight, flexible?" Barbara barely had time to respond before Bowerman grabbed the waffle iron, rushed to his garage, and started pouring liquid urethane into it. He forgot to spray it with a non-stick agent first. The waffle iron glued shut and was ruined forever. But it didn't matter. Bowerman had his breakthrough. Over the next year, he refined the concept: hand-cut rubber soles with waffle patterns, nylon uppers flown in from Japan, glued together by Nike employees in makeshift workshops. They called the first version the Moon Shoe, because the waffle tread left imprints in dirt that looked like the footprints astronauts left on the lunar surface. It debuted at the 1972 U.S. Olympic track and field trials in Eugene, Oregon. Runners loved it. The feel, the traction, the lightness. Word spread fast. By 1974, Bowerman had refined the design into the legendary waffle trainer. On February 26th of that year, Nike received a U.S. patent for the waffle sole. This was the shoe that put Nike on the map, the shoe that made them different. Not just another distributor selling someone else's product, but innovators, pioneers, and Phil Knight knew they needed a face for the brand, someone who embodied what Nike stood for. Enter Steve Prefontaine. Pre, as everyone called him, was the most famous distance runner in America. A working-class kid from Coos Bay, Oregon, cocky, fearless. He ran every race like his life depended on it, setting American records from 2,000 meters to 10,000 meters. In 1973, Nike signed Prefontaine to a $5,000 yearly stipend. Their first major endorsement deal. He worked in their store, talked up the shoes at track meets, sent handwritten notes to young runners recommending Nike products. Pre was Nike's soul, everything the brand wanted to represent: rebellion, determination, authenticity. Pre embodied it. Phil Knight would later say, Pre was a rebel from a working-class background, a guy full of cockiness and guts. Pre's spirit is the cornerstone of this company's soul. And then, tragedy. On May 29, 1975, after a race he'd organized against Finnish runners, Steve Prefontaine died in a car accident. He was 24 years old. The running world was devastated. Nike was devastated. Phil Knight had lost not just an endorser, but a friend, a symbol. But Pre's legacy lived on. His fighting spirit became embedded in Nike's DNA, and his memory would drive the company forward through the challenges ahead. Throughout the 1970s, Nike grew explosively. Revenue climbed year after year, but growth came with a constant problem: cash. Here's the thing about the shoe business. You have to pay for inventory months before you can sell it. Nike was always stretching, always scrambling, always one bad quarter away from disaster. Banks were nervous, credit was tight. By 1980, Phil Knight's advisors were clear. Nike had to go public, sell shares, raise capital. It was the only way to fuel continued growth without risking everything on borrowed money. Phil hated the idea. Going public meant shareholders, board meetings, loss of control. The Oregon culture he'd built, casual, maverick, fiercely independent, would be threatened by Wall Street expectations. But he had no choice. On December 2, 1980, Nike went public at $22 per share. The company that had started with a $1,000 handshake was now valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. Phil Knight personally? He was worth $178 million overnight, on paper at least. Bill Bowerman, the coach who'd shaken hands on that original deal, was worth $9 million. The early employees who'd believed in the vision when it was just a crazy idea? Millionaires, every one of them. Nike had arrived. But success, as Phil was about to learn, creates its own dangers. By the mid-1980s, Nike was in trouble. A company called Reebok had emerged from nowhere, capitalizing on the aerobics craze that Nike had completely missed. Reebok made soft, comfortable shoes for fitness classes, something Nike's hardcore running DNA had overlooked. Between 1982 and 1984, Nike's stock dropped 66%. Revenue growth stalled. Profits cratered. Phil Knight, who had briefly stepped away from day-to-day management, came racing back to save his company. Nike needed a miracle, and that miracle came from the most unlikely source, a 21-year-old basketball player who didn't even want to sign with them. His name was Michael Jordan. In 1984, Michael Jordan was a junior at the University of North Carolina. He'd hit the game-winning shot in the 1982 NCAA championship. He was about to be drafted third overall by the Chicago Bulls, and every shoe company in America wanted him. Jordan wanted Adidas. He grew up wearing their shoes, loved their style, felt loyal to the brand. Converse was also in the mix. They sponsored his college team. Nike? Nike was a running shoe company. What did they know about basketball? But inside Nike, a sports marketing executive named Sonny Vaccaro saw something in Jordan that others missed. Not just talent. Every scout could see the talent. Vaccaro saw a star, a brand, a cultural icon waiting to happen. Vaccaro had first noticed Jordan during the 1982 NCAA championship game, the way Jordan moved, the confidence, the clutch performance. Vaccaro became obsessed. When Nike's basketball division discussed signing multiple players for their budget, Vaccaro argued they should bet everything on one kid. Put the entire basketball budget behind Michael Jordan. Don't spread the money around. Focus it like a laser. Phil Knight was skeptical. So were the board members. Betting everything on a rookie who hadn't played a single professional game? What if he got injured? What if he flopped? But Nike was desperate. Running shoes weren't enough anymore. They needed basketball, and Vaccaro was convincing. There was just one problem. Michael Jordan didn't want Nike. The person who changed that was Michael's mother, Dolores Jordan. Dolores saw what Michael couldn't see, that Nike was hungrier than the other companies, that they would work harder to build something special around her son. She convinced Michael to at least visit Nike's headquarters in Oregon, hear their pitch. So Michael flew to Beaverton with his parents, and Nike pulled out all the stops. They didn't just offer a contract, they offered a partnership, a signature shoe line, his name, his brand, something no athlete had ever received before at this scale. The offer, $2.5 million over 5 years, plus, and this was revolutionary, a royalty on every shoe sold, 25% of the profits from his signature line. Adidas had basically told Jordan they'd think about a signature line maybe someday. Nike was offering it now. Michael Jordan signed with Nike. What happened next exceeded everyone's wildest expectations. Nike's internal projections estimated the Air Jordan line would generate $3 million in its first 3 years. Conservative, reasonable. The Air Jordan 1 hit stores in 1985. In the first year alone, Nike sold $126 million worth of Air Jordans. $126 million. Against a 3-year projection of $3 million. The shoes were controversial from the start. The NBA actually banned them for violating uniform regulations. The black and red colorway was too flashy, they said. Nike paid Jordan's fines and turned the ban into marketing gold. Banned by the NBA became a selling point. Michael Jordan didn't just sell shoes, he transformed what athletic endorsement could mean. Before Jordan, athletes endorsed products. After Jordan, athletes were products. Entire brands built around a single personality. And Nike, the company that was hemorrhaging market share just 2 years earlier, was suddenly the hottest brand in sports. But Phil Knight wasn't done. He understood something crucial. A great product and a great athlete weren't enough. You needed to make people feel something. You needed to tell a story that went beyond shoes. You needed just do it. In 1988, Nike's advertising agency, Weeden and Kennedy, was preparing a major television campaign. Multiple commercials for different sports, running, basketball, cross-training, women's fitness, all different creative teams, all different approaches. The night before presenting to Nike, co-founder Dan Weeden reviewed the work and realized something was missing. The commercials didn't feel unified. They needed a tagline, something to tie everything together. Weeden sat with the problem, and his mind drifted to a strange place. Years earlier, he'd read about a man named Gary Gilmore, a convicted murderer who faced execution by firing squad in Utah in 1977. When asked if he had any final words, Gilmore said, "Let's do it." Weeden was struck by that, the simplicity, the defiance, the way someone facing the ultimate moment could push through with those words. He tweaked it slightly, changed "let's" to "just," made it more personal, more direct. Just do it. When Weeden pitched the tagline to Nike, not everyone was convinced. Phil Knight wasn't sure they needed a slogan at all. Other executives shrugged. Weeden pushed back. "Trust me on this one," he said. "Give it a chance." The campaign launched, and the response was immediate, overwhelming, deeply personal. People called Nike, wrote letters, told stories about what "just do it" meant to them, how it motivated them to run that extra mile, start that business, ask out that person, leave that bad situation. Just do it wasn't just about sports. It was about life, about overcoming hesitation, about action over paralysis. And it transformed Nike from a shoe company into a lifestyle brand. The numbers tell the story. In 1988, Nike's annual revenue was $877 million. By 1998, just 10 years later, revenue had exploded to $9.2 billion, a 1,000% increase. In 1990, Nike officially became the largest sports footwear and apparel company in the world. Phil Knight, the shy kid who couldn't make the football team, the average student who sold shoes from his trunk, the accountant who dreamed about Japanese running shoes, was now running a global empire. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, Nike kept expanding. Tiger Woods, Serena Williams, Cristiano Ronaldo, LeBron James. The greatest athletes across every major sport wore the swoosh. The company diversified beyond shoes, apparel, equipment, subsidiary brands like Converse and Hurley. Revenue climbed past $10 billion, then $20 billion, then $30 billion. But life, as Phil Knight learned painfully, doesn't care about business success. In 2004, Phil's oldest son Matthew died in a scuba diving accident in El Salvador. He was 34 years old. Phil stepped down as CEO later that year. Some of it was planned. He was 66, ready to let a new generation take over. But part of it was grief, the weight of losing a child. He stayed involved as chairman until 2016. But something shifted in Phil after Matthew's death. His focus expanded beyond business. Philanthropy became central to his life. Phil and his wife Penny have given away more than $3.6 billion, over $500 million to Stanford University, over $500 million to the University of Oregon. Massive donations to cancer research, to education, to the arts. His other son, Travis Knight, found his own path, not in shoes, but in animation. Travis runs Laika, a stop-motion film studio that created Coraline and Kubo and the Two Strings. Phil, the former Shoe Dog, became an executive producer on animated movies. Life takes unexpected turns. In 2016, Phil published his memoir, Shoe Dog. It became a bestseller, a raw, honest account of building Nike from nothing, the struggles, the near bankruptcies, the relationships, the obsession. And it reminded people of something important. Phil Knight wasn't born a billionaire. He wasn't touched by some special genius. He was just a guy with an idea and a willingness to pursue it relentlessly, even when everyone else thought he was crazy. So what can we learn from Phil Knight? First, you don't have to be special to build something extraordinary. Phil wasn't the fastest runner. He wasn't the smartest student. He wasn't even the most confident person in the room. But he had an idea he believed in, and he refused to let it go. Second, partnerships matter. Phil couldn't have built Nike without Bill Bowerman's innovation, without Jeff Johnson's early sales, without Sonny Vaccaro's basketball vision, without the athletes who gave the brand its soul. Building an empire is a team sport. Third, timing is everything, but you create your own timing by being ready when opportunity arrives. Phil's Stanford paper sat dormant for years before he acted on it. The waffle iron was a random breakfast moment that Bowerman was prepared to seize. Michael Jordan fell into Nike's lap because they had built the capability to offer something revolutionary. Fourth, crisis is opportunity. Nike's near-death experience in the mid-'80s forced them to think differently, to bet on Jordan, to reinvent themselves. The companies that survive are the ones that adapt when everything falls apart. And finally, the work is the reward. Phil Knight is worth approximately $35 billion today. But when he reflects on his life, he doesn't talk about the money. He talks about the journey, the early morning runs, the camaraderie of the butt faces, his affectionate name for the early Nike team, the feeling of building something meaningful with people he cared about. In Shoe Dog, Phil wrote something that captures his philosophy better than any business lesson. The cowards never started, and the weak died along the way. That leaves us. Phil Knight didn't build Nike by being the smartest or the fastest or the luckiest. He built it by refusing to stop running, by getting up every time he got knocked down, by believing in a crazy idea when everyone else thought he was wasting his time. He started with $50 and a handshake. He ended up creating one of the most recognizable brands in human history. That's the art of building billions, not through genius, not through luck, but through relentless, obsessive, never-give-up pursuit of a vision. Phil Knight turns 87 years old this year. He still lives in Oregon, near the Nike campus he built. He still follows the company, still cares about the products, still wears the shoes. And somewhere, right now, there's another shy kid with a crazy idea. Another average student who sees something everyone else misses. Another dreamer selling something out of the back of their car. Phil Knight's story isn't just history. It's an invitation. A reminder that the distance between nothing and everything is just the willingness to take the first step. To just do it.